Welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome back to the Low Carb MD podcast. Tro, you did it again, man.
Yeah, look, we have somebody who I've been following for a very long time who's done great work all the way back from Avandia. And he's kind of tackled interests, tackled pharma, tackled, big agri, big food, big pharma, and really caught my attention in recent history during COVID because he's done such an amazing job as an investigative journalist. We can go into all the awards he's gotten. We can go into some of the amazing pieces he's done, but I'd like to start by talking about his most infamous piece, let's just say, because he did an expose in the British Medical Journal, and he was uniformly censored by Facebook, Twitter, for basically telling the truth. And he has exposed so much industry corruption through his work using the Freedom of Information Act, looking at emails from Fauci, Collins, all the way up the food chain. So one, I'm just excited to have you here, Paul Thacker. This is like, you are literally what I wish all journalists would be like. So I just want to start out by saying we need more people like you. We need more people like Catherine Eban, who we had on, another investigative journalist, Nina Teicholz, Gary Taubes. I view you guys all in that same category, people who really uphold truth and uphold real journalism.
Well, thanks for having me on. And I wish that there were more like me, because then I wouldn't be being harassed for doing what I do.
Yeah, it would be nice to have more targets, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, because when you do this kind of reporting, what happens is you end up getting a lot of flack, usually from there'll be like crazy advocates on Twitter, or there'll be like corporate front groups. And if they had more people to focus on, they would spend less time screwing around with me.
Yeah, I mean, we're I'd say compatriots. We have the same flack. We get, some of the same people probably don't like us equally. But can we talk about, can we start with your most recent piece in the British Medical Journal? And can we talk about what exactly happened? I think a lot of people are looking at COVID reporting and, lab leak, and kind of, they don't know what to make of it, right? They see kind of vocal opposition being, censored. They don't know what to make of it. So can you start, by talking about your British Medical Journal piece that I know it should definitely, if you haven't won an award, you should get an award. But can you start talking about that, and can we build from there? Because I don't think people know how deep this goes.
So the first thing to understand is that as soon as this pandemic started, there were really only two big questions that were hanging out there. And one is, how did this pandemic start? Because if you understand how a pandemic starts, just like in anything else, how a fire starts, how a plane crash happens, the first thing you understand is, why did this happen, so that you can prevent the next one, right? I mean, that's why you always try to figure out, like, how do we get here, so we know how to not get here again. So that was number one. Then the second thing to understand is, how do we deal with this pandemic? And in dealing with this pandemic, we had three major sort of public health issues that we used, which were vaccines. Another one was masks. Another one were, lockdowns and school closures. So those were the three main that are and they're still very controversial right now. And what I found is, I actually just wrote a chapter on this about the future of journalism. I just finished this chapter today. And what's really happened is the media really, especially the science journalists, really screwed up on handling all these issues. And it's for a variety of reasons. One is simply because they're just by the fact that you're at a place like the New York Times means that what you're going to do is you're oftentimes going to go with whatever a conventional narrative is. And you're going to have conventional narrative, and then you enforce that. Then when you get specifically into the science writers, what you get is and then second on that, we have a second problem. This is very specific to America, which is this thing called the Great Awakening that happened, which is when journalists and sort of hyper liberal, white, urban, educated elites kind of jumped and shifted over politically far to the left. And this group of people they're so far to the left that many white liberals now are to the left on racial issues of Black people, are to the left of immigration issues of Hispanic Americans. And so we've had this major shift, and the journalists are part of this demographic. Now, then what happened next was we had Trump came along, and this is right around the time that Trump came along, and we have this sort of complete like meltdown amongst white liberal elites in which they simply cannot stand or tolerate certain perspectives if they happen to have come or happen to have touched or happen to have breathed upon by Trump or Republicans or conservatives. And so we've lost this sort of dispassionate ability to look at issues from a factual perspective, and now they've become simply polarized. Now, all of these problems, are within the science writing community. And again, I call these people science writers. I don't call them journalists because many of them don't do actual journalism. They do very little reporting. What their job has been narrative enforcement.
Can I talk about that, Paul? Just because I know from Freedom of Information Act that, for example, clinical trialists at the NIH who deal, right. This is just nutrition, this was my area. They've literally emailed, pre-leaked, sent in from their NIH emails, the narrative they want to, journalists, quote unquote, science, what do you call them? Science writers from Toronto who have, relationships with other doctors in Canada, just to craft a narrative that's, right. So we see this all the time in nutrition. But what you're saying is a lot more widespread. It's a narrative-based approach to journalism.
Right. So now what you're talking about specifically in that area, just so you know, is some of these emails came out. What was happening at the NIH, I mean, we should just come back to that, and we'll come back to that in a second. But so what's happened is now with science reporters, you have another problem, which we'll talk about these emails you had, which is they're incredibly close to their sources. Now, all reporters eventually over time become very close and overly comfortable with their sources. And the biggest example we have of this, recently was the 2008 economic meltdown. And after that happened, people were like, well, how the hell did this sneak up on us? And then when people began looking at it, they're like, well, it snuck up on you because these reporters are in bed with the bankers and the investors. They don't see them as people they report on. They see them as masters of the universe. They want to do great profiles of how awesome they are. So this is always been a problem within the media, but it has just been, all of these issues just kind of really came together in the pandemic to where we've just gotten terrible reporting. And I'll give you, in one example of what happened was, from the very beginning of this pandemic on the vaccines, I noticed that as the vaccines started rolling out, you would see an article appear in the New York Times, and it would talk about Pfizer's vaccine, the clinical, and you'd read down like 4 or 5 paragraphs down, you realize like, wait, they're just reporting on Pfizer's press release. This isn't a study that's been published. This is not data that's been submitted to any regulatory agency. This is just the press release. Like, you did a story about a press release. Yeah. Which is just absolutely amazing when you think about that. I mean, this is basically remanufacturing and spitting back out the company's public relations. Now, in one particular example, which I tracked back, Rochelle Walensky, who now runs the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, was giving grand rounds at, I don't know where, I think it was somewhere in the Midwest. And someone captured a brief segment of that and put it up on Twitter. And on Twitter, and in the ground rounds, what she was talking about was, well, hey, when we first saw, were we too overly, relying on vaccines? Were we a little bit overly optimistic about how this was going to fix the pandemic? She says, sure. She's like, when I saw, the 95% on CNN, I thought, well, okay, this is it. And I was like, okay, so like what really turned her head, the woman who is in charge of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, is an article that appeared on CNN. So I went and I tracked back that article and read it. And then I compared that article to the press release that Pfizer put out earlier that day. There's nothing new in the CNN article that did not appear in the Pfizer press release. There's no outside perspective or analysis. The only thing that was different in there was like a paragraph or two explaining how mRNA vaccines function. So this has been sort of the way the media has reported, I don't even say reported, but written about these vaccines almost from the very beginning. Now,
do you think that because they were scared and they wanted to, and they knew that people would be interested, or do you think it represents like a systemic bias that's in our media right now, which is heavily pro-industry, heavily pro-pharma? I mean, the dollars come from there. The dollars don't come from upholding values and upholding truth and serving people. That's not what they do. Although I guess traditionally that's what they should be doing, right?
Well, I think that's part of it, but also there's something very weird about vaccines, that they are not treated the same way as other topics in science. And the latest example of this that I saw was, I just found out that John Ioannidis, who is a professor at Stanford, had submitted an article to a couple of preprint servers about, I think it was about efficacy of one of the vaccines or how long they were going to last. I can't remember what it was, but it was on vaccines. Both of these preprint servers, they're just places that you just put something up to be looked at, rejected his preprint manuscript on vaccines. One told him, hey, you can upload it here after you publish it. The point of these servers is to place something before you publish it, like to get it kind of get it out there and start a discussion. It ended up going into a journal published by Nature. But the whole point is that you can't even put a vaccine preprint that makes calls into questions the efficacy of vaccines or how good they are on a preprint server. Like, I don't know if any other subject in science is handled that way. Now, to put this in another idea, I think what's also going on is that because we're in this pandemic, or I mean, we're coming out of it now, so there's much more open discussion about these vaccines. The German health industry, the German health ministry just put out some sort of analysis that now we're having side effects with these COVID vaccines every 1 in 5,000 doses, I believe is what they said, which is like, I couldn't even believe it, like they would put something out there. But the other thing that's going on, I think, is in this, because I try to not get too focused on the issue I'm looking at. I try to see other examples. And what what this makes me think of is back in the first Gulf War, we had sent these Patriot missiles over to Israel to protect them from the Scuds coming out of Iraq, because we were worried that what Iraq was trying to do, Saddam Hussein was trying to do, he was trying to draw Israel into the conflict. And so to keep Israel out of the conflict, we sent them these Patriot missiles, which would shoot down these Scud missiles that the Iraqis were launching into Israel. Now, what was interesting is it came out later that, guess what? These things don't really work all that well. But no one wanted to hear it, right? Because we're in the middle of a war, and so no one really wants to hear this. And so I think this is kind of the same issue with these vaccines, is everyone wants to believe them. You know, and Rochelle Walensky even said this during Grand Rounds. You're like, oh, I want to be so optimistic. And so that's, I think, is part of it, but also there's something very strange. Just
sounds like a religion a little bit, right? Like they're just fear and belief and no real solid backing, which is what you're kind of asking for.
The only thing I can say is, and I wrote about this, is that, like, what I can tell you now is that if there is an FDA approved product, and that product that has gone through FDA approval process, if that thing is called a pharmaceutical or if it's called a device, you can criticize it. If that thing is labeled a vaccine, no, sir, we don't talk bad stuff about that.
Well, what about vaccines that are pulled off the market, like Zostavax, like the J&J vaccine? Are we allowed to criticize those vaccines, or those are also, because we had a viable product, Zostavax, was used for herpes zoster, and they pulled it off because it just didn't work well. So what's the problem? We pull vaccines all the time that just don't work well. we pulled the 1976 flu vaccine off the market because it was causing Guillain-Barré. Right?
There was
we have vaccines that don't work well. We just take them off.
Right. Well, everyone knows that. Everyone knows that, all products. I mean, one of the main things you learn if you're a physician that's good is that any intervention has side effects. That's just like basic, like coming out of the box, knowing how to be a practicing physician or knowing how to be a reporter that covers medicine. But when it comes to vaccines, all the rules of medicine, all the rules of journalism fall apart. You can't talk about these old vaccines that were pulled off the market. One vaccine that was pulled off the market recently was a vaccine for Lyme disease. And Vox, this like online kind of lefty website, ran an article that it was pulled off because of anti-vaxxers. It was pulled off because the thing was causing side effects. But the people who were having side effects were then relabeled as anti-vaxxers because this reporter just doesn't know what he's doing.
There's a little bit of anti-vax hysteria, wouldn't you say? Because I gotta be honest with you. I saw the same thing that you did. There was a angry Napoleon-like obesity doctor from Canada by the name of Yoni Friedhoff, who was saying you can't wait to give patients the vaccine before the trial results came out. And I was like, how do you recommend the vaccine before you've reviewed the data? And, quickly there was a attack by a bunch of people saying that I'm an anti-vaxxer. Now, that was the news to me because I recommend vaccines almost daily in my practice and my kids are vaccinated. So, do you think I've experienced the anti-vax hysteria. Do you think that there's a little bit of hysteria? I've been criticized by David Gorski, for example, from Science-Based Medicine, which I know we both don't like. They literally silenced my partner in crime here, Brian Lenskis, for just noting some observations that he saw in the clinic. And Brian, as far as I know, you've recommended vaccines as a 20-year practicing physician.
Yeah, the first time I was ever called anti-vaxxers because I was supporting Professor Tim Noakes on a low carb comment. Nothing to do with vax, nothing. And then all of a sudden, everyone starts saying you're an anti-vaxxer. I'm like, yeah, how am I making this connection between low carb is anti-vax? What does that mean? And then, I've been a standard of care medicine doctor all this time, but we all know, I mean, you have to be realistic. Tro, what is with the flu vaccine, what's the success rate generally in a year? Like, whenever the flu
so the average success, the average efficacy, over the last 15 years is somewhere between 10 to 60%, which means, minimally effective in healthy adults, but very effective in, somebody who's going to die from the flu, like, somebody 60 and older with comorbidities, right? Which is, which would have been a reasonable approach to this COVID vaccine. So what do you think, Paul? Is it just hysteria? Is it industry? Where does this come from?
There's a bunch of craziness. Both those people that you spoke about, Yoni Friedhoff and David Gore, I've blocked both of them on Twitter. They're both obnoxious. Neither of them really knows what they're talking about. And I have actually, so bringing up what you had brought up earlier, the first time I was called anti-vaxxer was when about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was reporting on this pesticide called glyphosate. And at this time, all these Monsanto trolls started saying like, well, what's your position on vaccines? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, what is my position on vaccine? What do you mean? Like, I don't know. I don't think about vaccines. I just I need a vaccine. I go get the vaccine. I don't think about these things. So this has been going on for some time.
Why do you think they make that connection though? Why do you think?
I think it's public relations. I think there's a public relations thing in the background that is causing this because I've seen it in so many different areas. And when you see messaging promoted over and over again, that's usually because there's some sort of public relations campaign. And for some reason, which I don't totally understand, and this is more of a feeling that I have just from having covered, covered disinformation campaigns in climate change, in chemicals, in pharmaceuticals. Like I can tell when there's a public relations campaign happening. And this feels very much.
You're an expert on this. You uncovered that Avandia, if I remember correctly, right? You uncovered that basically there was ghostwriting. I mean, Avandia, which is basically, pulled off the market. This is your area.
Yeah. So like so just so you know, like what I've done is I started off originally like 15 years ago looking into disinformation on climate change. And I started to see this campaign against a climate scientist named Michael Mann, who is a fairly prominent researcher in the area of climate. And, you know, but prior to him, I had run into another research physician named Fred Vom Saal. I was at a science conference, and Fred came up to me and was telling me, like, you know, Paul, you don't understand. And what he researches are these chemicals called endocrine disruptors. And Fred was telling me about how industry would, you know, replicate his studies and then use the wrong animals or use different dosages. And honestly, like at the time, I was like, you know, in my mid 30s, and I was like, okay, this guy's a nutter. You know, he like thinks that like these people are just totally unethical, and he doesn't like that they have different, you know, study results than he does. But then simultaneously, I'd heard about a guy named Tyrone Hayes, who's a professor at Berkeley who studies a chemical called atrazine. It's a pesticide.
Yeah.
And Hayes was saying the same thing about how, you know, oh, you know, what industry does is they make up results in these studies and publish studies that are false to try to, you know, to undermine my credibility. So I'd seen these like three guys, right? So this is in the mid 2000s. You know, one guy, Fred Vom Saal, University of Missouri, studies endocrine disruptors. This guy, Tyrone Hayes at Berkeley, who studies pesticides. And then this guy, Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist, who's having some of the same issues happen with him. And none of these guys know each other. They don't talk to each other, nothing. And I'm like, okay, either something's going on, or like I'm a collector of weirdos, and I keep finding all the weirdos in science. And so what I concluded was there are these industry campaigns. And so that's where I kind of got interested in this stuff. And then from there, I moved on to running investigations in the Senate into corruption in pharmaceuticals for Senator Grassley. And that's when I found that there was like the same thing happens in pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
Exact same thing.
We, you know, we're going to have, you know, the author here soon for, oh, geez, why am I blanking? The covering the Sacklers, you know,
Patrick Radden Keefe.
Yeah, pharma has done this again and again to, you know, basically using journals as marketing, using,
right.
You know, they, you know, they change the narrative. They work with, you know, industry. Right. And so you uncovered this for Avandia, if I remember correctly.
Right. So we put out a big report on Avandia that I wrote. It took me like 2 years.
So the diabetes drug, just so you guys know, was pulled off the market for causing a whole bunch of issues.
Right. So Avandia was the best-selling diabetes drug. It was a diabetes drug. I'm going to mess this up a little bit. The mechanism of action was it actually, it goes into the nucleus, and I can't remember exactly what it does. It turns on certain genes in the body. And then they were using a way to measure whether it was helping or not. But I think what they found out later, although it wasn't totally clear, is amongst these genes it was turning on was some genes were causing cardiovascular effects, like surprise, like you turn genes on and they might start bumping into other things, and who knows, you get a genetic cascade and you get these effects that you weren't looking for, weren't expecting. And so I put out several reports on this drug, and at the time it was like a $3 billion a year drug. It was the best-selling diabetes drug on the planet. Now, the guy who was behind the scenes helping to manipulate all this stuff for GlaxoSmithKline is a guy named Tachi Yamada. He was in charge of research at GSK. He then moved on to become the head of global research for the Gates Foundation, and also then went to work for the Clinton Foundation. So his career was not harmed at all. Then the guy who replaced him, who then I had to deal with directly when we were going, because Tachi had left a couple of years before all this stuff came out about Avandia, was a guy named...
The Gates Foundation just hires people who are like, you know, who are doing gross misconduct. I mean, they're just like, yeah, well, thank you.
No, they didn't. No, so the Gates Foundation did not know at the time what was going on. So he had been at, when we found out what was happening, he'd been at Gates Foundation for like 2 years. But we did send a letter directly to the Gates Foundation about what we had discovered about him. And he came in to the office and spoke with us. And I interviewed him for this issue. And one of the things I talked about was he was involved in intimidating a physician who had first figured out or suspected, it's hard to say, like, you know, he definitely had that idea, like, hey, I think this drug is bad. When it had first come on the market, in 2000. So now we're in 2008, 2009. Tachi Yamada's in the Senate, and I'm sitting across the table from him, grilling him with his lawyer. And during that interview, I asked Tachi about these emails, because we made these email public, where he had been the guy going after this physician, this academic. I think he's at University of Pennsylvania, I want to say, or maybe Penn State. I can't remember. And so I was asking Tachi about this. And so I said, so like, this is the only time you made a call about a physician, right? And he's like, yeah. He's like, okay. So then I let him talk some more. And then I said, so this was a singular event for you in your time at GSK, calling up about this physician, because what he had told us was, I wasn't calling the physician to intimidate him. I was trying to understand if he'd found a problem in our product, and I wanted to know. That's what he told me. I was like, that's a good idea. Like, he'd had some time to think about it. So he had a good response. And I'm like, are you sure you never done this before? And he's like, yes. And I said, okay, can I ask you about the other incident? And then I slid the emails across the table to him, because I knew he'd done it again, because I'd found it in the emails, and he didn't know I'd found it.
Wow.
So he had done this several times, at least twice, that we caught him doing this. And the guy who replaced him, who then went and testified before Congress that Avandia was fine, and who, when we put out our final report, I released the internal emails where, before he'd gone to testify before Congress and say everything was fine, he was pointing out, like, wow, our results are finding an increase in cardiovascular death, an increase in MIs. You know, so he knew internally what this drug was doing, and then went and testified for Congress and said the opposite. That guy was Moncef Slaoui. So where does Moncef Slaoui move on to? He ends up becoming in charge of Operation Warp Speed, appointed by Trump to help bring the vaccines to the market.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's funny how these things come full circle. And if you really look, if you pay attention, I mean, you know, go back into the big tobacco, you see the signs there. You have all the CEOs lined up, and I forget, it was the Senator Wyden interviewing them, basically asking, do you think it's addictive? Every single one says it's not addictive. And then 5 years later, we know, you know, they're all lying.
Right.
And so
and there's no penalty for these guys. That's the amazing part. And, you know, Paul, I have a question, since you're an expert in this area, because I'm not that bright. I'm just a doctor, right? So on Twitter, I notice all these people are attacking Jason Fung, me, Tro on the same day, like 10 doctors, 10 big influencers.
Right.
And I'm like, that's odd. Like, why would they all, like, they're saying the same talking points and everything? It was kind of weird. And then the next day, a new drug is released for obesity management. All of them are the same people are promoting it the next day, right? And you look and go, okay, if these guys are paid not directly from, because they say we're not paid by pharma, but if they're paid by the people who pharma are paying, right? How do we determine that? Is there any way to? Is there any transparency or anything where people have to disclose that they're getting paid by a PR firm to represent?
No, there's like a lot of times, I mean, there's so much PR going on that it's really hard to tell. Now, one ways we can track some of this, at least in physicians now, is because we had so many drug scandals in the United States. You know, and because when I was working on Avandia, prior to that, the Senate Finance Committee had been working on what was the pain drug that Merck put out?
OxyContin?
Oh,
no,
Tramadol.
no.
Oh, not Tramadol. That was J&J.
The one that they found out later was killing people.
Vioxx?
Vioxx. Yeah. So what happened is, when I joined the Senate in 2007, the committee investigators had already been looking into Vioxx, and what they found, so, you know, here's this drug and it's like killing people, like, whoa, who knew? So then they were like, okay, well, how did this happen? So what they did is they tracked back to see, how did this drug get on the market? And so they went back and looked at the FDA approval panel that had approved that drug, and they looked at all those physicians and like, wow, all of them seem to have, you know, financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. So what we then began working on, and I drafted this legislation and then helped to push it through, was a law called the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, which was eventually passed as part of Affordable Care Act. And so now you can look up physicians to see if they're taking money from companies. But of course, there are ways around this. Like, they may be getting money through like a cutout, you know, like, we don't always know. So it's not perfect, but it's helping somewhat. But
if they're getting paid by the PR firms, that wouldn't show up on the Sunshine Act, correct?
It's hard to say. Like, I mean, I think what's going to happen is we're going to see a scandal that, you know, so often what happens is when you look at things from like step back and look at them, so much of what we know is wrong in medicine is not exposed by other physicians. It's exposed through lawsuits. And so what happens is people are harmed. There's a lawsuit that happens. And in the discovery process, we find out who was being paid, the PR firms that were being hired, the physicians that were being paid for studies, what the company knew and when they knew it, and so that stuff can be very helpful. And I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a lawsuit where the lawyers are going to find out that, hey, all these doctors were taking all this money through a PR firm. It was not being put up on the open payments website. And so now we need to change the law.
Well, what happens if a product is protected because it's recommended as a, childhood vaccination? So what happens when, a journalist like you uncovers, potential issues at contract research organizations, maybe adverse events that are not being reported properly? What happens then? And then what happens when that product then gets blanket absolvement of all kind of liability because it's it's part of the vaccination schedule? Can you help me understand, your BMJ piece was about potential issues with some of the contract research organizations that dealt with the Pfizer mRNA vaccine. So
what I reported on was we had a whistleblower, a woman who worked for a contract research organization for Pfizer. And just to help you understand what these things are is when a company does a clinical trial, okay, so and in a clinical trial, like for like a normal pharmaceutical, you might have like 3,000 or 4,000 people that it's tested in, like over time, maybe 4,000 or 5,000, something like that. And the companies don't have like, places to do this. They don't have like, there's not like the Pfizer like research center which will come in. So what they do is they contract this stuff out. And so they might give like, let's say, University of Pennsylvania Medical School a contract to find 200 patients. And then they'll give another contract to University of California, San Francisco to do 150. And then they'll, and then you keep putting out contracts so you get up to your 3,000 or 4,000, whatever you need to study. In the case of this vaccine, there was like something like 45,000 people studied. And so they had to put out contracts to a lot of different universities and a lot of these private groups that also do this type of research. Well, they'll bring in patients and they'll study them according to the company's protocol. Now, what happened is one of these contract research organizations in Texas hired a woman who, when she came in, she immediately realized like, these people don't know what they're doing. They she'd been working and doing research for like 20 years. And she started documenting all the problems that she was seeing. And because she was in charge of like finding problems, well, they didn't want to hear this. So when she kept pointing out all the problems, they fired her. Well, before they fired her, she actually sent notified the FDA. And I think she put in like 11 examples of problems that she had found at the place she worked at. And this research organization, she pointed out that they had like taken in something like 1,000 people or something like, I can't remember what it was. We end up, and so we published a story on this with, documents she had provided. She'd actually, she also started like, saving her emails. She started recording her conversation. She realized what was going on was terrible. And so she started recording her conversations with her bosses. And I was listening to these things. And then after she contacted us, she went back and contacted those bosses again. And some of them had left. They're like, yeah, no, you were right. This place, like, they don't know what they're doing. Well, what was interesting is...
Well, is it incompetence or malfeasance or what's, is it just rush to get the vaccine because of warp speed? Or is it like, we specifically hired you because we know you do sloppy work and you're not going to look at adverse events? I mean, do we know what's,
Well, we can kind of know by just looking at the facts, right? She notified Pfizer also anonymously what was going on. Pfizer didn't do anything. She notified her bosses at the company. They didn't do anything. She notified Pfizer. They didn't do anything. She notified the FDA. They didn't do anything. And then after she left, Pfizer hired that company to do more vaccine research for them. They were one of the contract organizations that did the research on the clinical trial for kids for the Pfizer vaccine.
The one where at the FDA panel, the first comment basically said that your child has a higher likelihood of getting hit by lightning than of having a serious complication. Is that this is the vaccine you're talking about?
I think that's right. Yeah, I didn't listen on that. So what was interesting is what I found was so disturbing was, I mean, look, am I really shocked that like this company that's trying to put something through as fast as possible and make a ton of money was cutting corners? No. I mean, I've dealt with pharmaceutical companies forever. I mean, they have a history of lying. I mean, if you just go back and look, I mean, there was a front page. I put it in one of my newsletter. You know, Pfizer accused of malfeasance. It was a headline in the New York Times in 2008. I mean, these companies have a history of lying and being dishonest. I mean, prior to the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico with BP, the industry that had paid the most in fines to the United States federal government in the history of our country was pharma. They've been caught repetitively lying about side effects, illegal marketing, just on and on. I mean, there's books. You just go to your Barnes and Noble. There's in the medicine. There's several books written about this. Like, we all know this stuff. So I wasn't really surprised. What stunned me was that the FDA didn't seem to care. That's what bothered me.
Actually, if you've read Bottle of Lies, we had Catherine Eben on a while back, and she basically highlighted how they don't care. And there's
how they're not inspecting these plants, and they send the inspector out, and then they take them out and get pictures of them in compromising positions with prostitutes and things like that. And then they say, okay, you inspected and everything's fine, right?
Well,
it's incredible.
It's deeper than that, right?
Yeah.
It's much deeper than that. You know, if you look at it, right, even in this kind of modern environment, right, we disbanded the AdComs, right? Biden disbanded the AdComs, and 2 people resigned. 2 deputies at the FDA resigned.
Right.
So the people who had integrity, who cared, who really wanted to do something about this and change it and were upholding evidence, they've left, right? Their culture, we still have a Tuskegee culture at the CDC and the FDA. That's what we have, right? And that's unfortunate. And so I would have thought people would have been like, wow, look at this piece. Like, we got investigative journalists, the editors of BMJ reviewed it, it's published. You know, you would have think that the media would have been all over it as something they should promote, but instead, what did they do?
So then what happened was the story took off. And just so you know, right now, there's a way of measuring the impact of articles in science, studies and articles in science, and it's called altmetric. And what this does is it does a compilation of measuring like how many times your article is quoted in the news, how many times it's tweeted on social media, et cetera, et cetera. The altmetric score for that article is now something over 45,000. It's the second highest altmetric score ever since altmetric's been around in like 8 years. And it actually, the prior year in 2020, the highest altmetric score was something like 30,000. And this article I wrote passed that within like 2 weeks. You know, I mean, it just like blew right through it quickly. And it was because for a couple things, people on social media and news organizations outside the United States. No news organization in the United States picked this up. Now, who did pick it up was a fact checker called leadstories.com for Facebook, who wrote this ridiculous, like, I didn't even know what to say about it. Like, it was so funny. My editor called me up and she's like, Paul, what's going on with this thing? I'm like, I looked at the thing and said, like, did the BMJ's blog find? I'm like, this wasn't a blog. This was an investigation that was based on documents. Like, I actually spent like almost like 2 weeks reviewing the documents before I even called the whistleblower up.
Didn't they say, I remember reading that, and it was like, well, you know, some people who we consider anti-vax promoted your thing, so we labeled it as disinformation, right? Like, right, you know, that was like, it was like the most stupid thing you've ever written, but they censored you completely.
Yeah.
They censored you, and Lead Stories as by the way, the minute I tweeted about them, I was shadow banned on Facebook and Instagram completely.
Right. Oh, yeah. So leadstories.com just did another fact check recently. And this was about a preprint that's out there right now about vaccine side effects. So it's a preprint. It's not a study that's been published anywhere yet. And in their fact check to prove that this preprint was wrong, they accused the authors of using a database called VAERS. which is a self-report that goes in, I believe, to the FDA. So it's all self-reported information. It's not vetted or anything like that. And everyone understands that, like, you know, this is just kind of a draft of potential problems, because self-reports are inherently, from a scientific viewpoint, like not very trustworthy, but they do serve as a sort of a signal to cause you to, like, let's pay attention to this stuff. So they accuse them of their using in the study the VAERS database, a database they didn't use. Like, if you read the study, they actually use the clinical trial data submitted by Pfizer and Moderna. So this fact check, like, just totally screwed everything up. They literally just don't know what they're doing. But in my case, what they've done is they couldn't find any errors because there weren't any errors. Because before I went back into journalism, I spent 3.5 years in the Senate, where the people I was sitting across the table from are the lawyers at the big law firms in DC, who will go through every single word that you've written in a report out of the Senate to look for errors. So I know how to make sure I write things that don't have errors in them, or don't have openings that give someone else something to come after. So what these fact checkers do is they don't check facts, because there were no facts that were wrong in the article. They're checking narratives. And the narrative that was wrong is, it was a narrative that was critical of possible problems in Pfizer's clinical trial. What was also interesting is, after this article came out, I was immediately, of course, called anti-vaxx. And what was funny is, when I got the, when I was assigned the article, I told my wife's a research physician, and I told my wife, I said, hey, I'm about to go into a hole. I've just gotten assigned this article, and I can tell it's gonna be like 2 weeks of me just working around the clock. And my wife was like also at the same, she was finishing up writing her PhD. And so I was just like, okay, this is not good. You know, we've got a 3-year-old daughter, and thank God our in-laws are here, like, helping to watch. But, and my wife said, well, which vaccine was it? And I said, it's Pfizer. And she says, that's the one we got. And I was like, oh shit, I forgot that's the one that we both got. So, like, I had to disclose that in the article, because I was writing about Pfizer, and I was just like, I think I should disclose this, because, like, otherwise people will say, like, I took Moderna or whatever. But so, like, it's disclosed in the article that I'm vaccinated with Pfizer's vaccine, but I was still called anti-vax. So,
yeah, that's,
like,
the amazing thing is people who have come out saying that they've had injuries, they call them anti-vax. Like, well, they got the vax.
right,
They got
exactly.
it. Like, if they were anti-vax, they wouldn't have got it in the first place. So I think it's one of those crazy, like, you make these connections.
It's gaslighting.
Yeah,
it's literally gaslighting. I mean, that's the whole narrative about over the Lyme vaccine, is that, you know, it's people who are anti-vax, but the reason why the vaccine was pulled from the market, because they were sued by people who had been vaccinated with the vaccine. I mean, so, I mean, like, but the thing is that, like, what I've concluded is that vaccines are magic. They don't have to meet the criteria of other areas of science. In other areas, in other products approved by the FDA, you can criticize them. You look to see the 3 major things you look at any sort of medical intervention. What is the efficacy? What is the side effects? And what are the costs? Those are the 3 things you look at repetitively over and over on any medical intervention. You're not allowed to do that with vaccines. For whatever reason, you can't upload a vaccine preprint to a preprint server. You have to publish it in the study. You know, you can't use the company's own data to do a preprint, because then you'll be accused of being anti-vax for using the VAERS data, the data you didn't use. So there's just examples over and over again of this happening. The craziest one, I think, that was the most hilarious was, because I've pointed out over and over again, I was like, this is weird, because people are constantly being banned for criticizing these companies that are putting out these vaccines on the market. Yet these companies have long histories of lying. Like, they've been, like, sued for this and paid fines over this, and they are never banned on social media. Do you know how you can get banned on social media? Is if you are a reporter like Alex Gutentag, who took direct snippets of information out of Pfizer's own press release on the vaccine clinical trial for children. She put that into a tweet and said, hey, look, they did this, 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 and this. She was banned until someone pointed out, these are direct copy paste out of Pfizer's own press release.
Yeah, we've seen that I've seen it over and over again, where they're quoting studies, you know, Peter McCullough being one of them, that he's quoting the study, here's the post, right? And they, you know, it's misinformation. And so I think it's a really scary time. And the other thing I would ask, since you're an expert in this area, how could we have emergency use for this long where they don't say it's FDA approved?
So that I don't know, because this is like getting into a lot of weird COVID pandemic stuff. which is like so totally new. And I want to say one thing too, like, I don't fault the United States federal government for making mistakes on dealing with the pandemic. I mean, this is a terrible, incredibly complicated issue to deal with. You got this thing coming, and yeah, we have all this research and stuff showing us how we deal. But you know what? Research is not the same as having to deal with stuff. It's like, that's like, talk a bunch of firemen sitting around talking about how are we going to put out this, deal with this house on fire. Like, the way you deal with a house on fire is you've like put out fires like 50, 60 times, and you know how to do it. And I feel like what happened with the government in this situation is the pandemic started, they jumped in the fire truck, they got out of the truck, and they didn't like, how do we hook the hose up to the fire hydrant? Like, oh, where's the ladder? How do we get the ladder off the truck? And that's fine. I get it, but the problem is the way the government handled this was they couldn't come forward and say, hey, we think these vaccines might do this, or we think that masks like could help, or we think that school. No, they came out and said, vaccines do this, masks do this. We must close schools. And if you say anything else, you're wrong, and you'll be banned, and you'll be attacked.
Not only that, but it was a top-down messaging, right? So there was emails from Collins and from Fauci that were very much geared towards stopping anything up except the narrative they wanted. And you uncovered some of those, and you published on some of them in your, Substack.
Yes. So the latest one I'm coming out with, which will be on Tuesday, is the latest thing that's happening right now is when people are sending in Freedom of Information Act requests, the government they redact things, and they do this for legal reasons. And there's various reasons why. One is for privacy concerns, one is for if the government allows the government to like talk about issues, there's various exemptions. And they have numbers: exemption 4, exemption 5, exemption 6, these sorts of things. And there's an example where that I'm gonna be writing about on Tuesday. There was a guy who had gotten some documents back from the NIH that concerned these communications early on in the pandemic, in like February of 2020, when everyone was trying to figure out like, how did this thing start? Like, what happened? And there's communications by a guy named Christian Anderson, who's a research physician. I mean, I'm sorry, he's not a physician, he's a researcher, epidemiologist, I believe, and out on the West Coast. And all these documents were heavily redacted. So the reporter looking, it's like, this makes no sense why they use this privacy concerns. So they went back and started litigating the redactions. So you go back and litigate, and you tell the judge, like, I don't think they should be able to black this stuff out. He then got sent back the same 24 pages or 24, 25 pages that were also redacted, but for different reasons. In the exact same redactions, they just changed the reasons why you can't see this stuff. So this is what's happening: is the government is heavily redacting stuff. They're doing what they can to protect, the head of the NIH, the NIH, and I think mostly Anthony Fauci. Fauci has gotten a number of things wrong in how he's dealt with this pandemic. I've had, like, I was a congressional investigator. I had to send letters to people notifying them that they were breaking the law when they were providing false, misleading information to us. It's called 1001. And Fauci went before Congress and he lied about the research that was being funded in China. He lied. I looked at that, and as soon as I saw what he said, I'm like, this is a lie. This fits the legal definition for misleading. And so
we're talking about the gain of function research. He basically they changed the definition.
The definition of gain of function.
And so most people don't understand this, but I think it's hard. Like, my wife's an attorney, right? Brilliant person, right? And I'm a physician, right? So, and we don't really cross paths. She knows the litigation stuff. I know the medical science stuff. And I'm trying to explain to her, there is a system of control, and it's tough to explain to people unless they see the whole picture, unless they see the chronic pharma issues, the chronic industry issues, the way they silence people, the kind of the silent ways with which they work, right? PR firms, silencing opposition. Here we have one of the most widely cited BMJ articles that was literally censored. Right. And they're redacting, Freedom of Information Act. They're trying to control narrative. When people hear me talk like this, they're like, it can't be. It can't be.
Oh, it totally is. The latest thing, I think, and then I'm gonna have to go, that I think might help to uncover some of this stuff. There are 2 lawsuits now which are moving forward. One is from, I think they're combined. It's the Missouri Attorney General and the Louisiana Attorney General. And they are both suing, I believe it's the federal government and the social media companies, because there's concern, and I think a pretty good amount of evidence to show that people's First Amendment rights are being stomped on. So the federal government cannot limit your freedom of speech. The government can't do that. Now, these social media companies do that, but that's not violating the First Amendment because they're private companies. And so like, they're not the government. The Constitution talks about the government can't do this stuff. But what if what's happening is the government is telling these companies what they should shut down, right? So essentially these companies are acting as proxies for the United States federal government. Now, there's quite a bit of evidence showing that that's what's happening. There's quite a bit of collusion between Facebook, Twitter, these social media companies, and the CDC and the NIH. Now, what's going to get us there, because some of these, there's been some lawsuits that's been brought against the social media companies, and inevitably they've been kicked out of court because they've not had what's legally called standing, meaning in this particular case, you don't have enough evidence to show that this is what's happening. And what the people come back and say, well, that's why we need to go to discovery to see the internal emails that they have, but they can't get there. Well, I think we're going to get there with these two lawsuits from the attorney generals, because the judge has allowed them to move forward with the discovery, that they'll be able to ask for documents from the federal government, from these companies. Now, the federal government just filed a motion to dismiss, but then just yesterday, because of a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, emails popped up showing this internal collusion between CDC and these social media companies. And I think that this is really how we're going to get into, what's happening. The second thing that's going to cause this, and this is going to be really interesting how this happens, is we have an election coming up in November. And there have been an innumerable number of letters from senators and congressmen asking for the NIH and the CDC to explain themselves, decisions they've been made, and they've not been responded to, because both houses, the Senate and the House, are now run by Democrats, and the guy in office is a Democrat. Biden is a Democrat. And the way it works right now in the United States federal government is Congress does not act as an independent check on the executive. Congress basically lines up with the political parties that they're in. So the Democrats now are like 30 years ago, Democrats would be asking questions of the guy in the office about this stuff. That's not how it works right now, because Americans are so partisan. So what's going to happen is the House is going to flip to become Republican. It's about a 50-50 chance it's going to happen in the Senate too. But as soon as that happens in the House reconstitutes around in February. We come back and they're sworn in. It takes about a month for the House to reconstitute itself. I would say by February, March of next year, subpoenas are going to be coming out the door from all these House congressional investigative committees. The people who did the kind of work that I exactly know how to do. So I know exactly what's going to be happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Paul, I know, want to be mindful of your time. I know you have, but I wish I could have a longer discussion with you. You sound, your work is amazing. I follow it. Guys, if you are not following the DisInformation Chronicles, please, follow it. How can people find you if they want to reach you?
So anyone can reach me on Twitter. I have my email where anyone can reach me, or also at the DisInformation Chronicle. So my Twitter is Thacker PD. So it's THACKERPD for Paul David.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. That hour went way too fast. Appreciate your time.
All right. Hey, thanks for having me on.